Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gil Compton, and I will be your moderator for this session. I'm here to support you and the presenter. So if you have any questions or need to any help with the Zoom or the interface, you can use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, find my name, Gil Compton, and send me a message directly to me. I'll do my best to help resolve any concerns that you have. The title of the session is CSU, Cost of Financial Aid. And here is your presenter, Dean Coolyu, who is the statewide director of financial aid for the California State University of the Office of the Chancellor. We're still admitting a couple participants, Dean, but go ahead and give us what you got. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gil. Thank you all for stopping by this afternoon. I was thinking this is so much different than in person because you always have that awkward moment when a session is supposed to start and people are chatting and you have to kind of a politically correct way to get them to settle down. So I don't have that worry. So that's one less stress. So to begin with, wanted to take a few minutes to explore what affordable means. Next slide, please, Gil.
One more.
And one more, please.
There you go.
So this definition came from the Forward 50 subcommittee, which was, I believe, 2018, a group with NASA, the National Association of Financial Aid Administrators, Department of Ed. And this is a rather lengthy definition, but the alignment between the student's desired educational goal and total costs, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because affordability and afford is a term we often hear and is also the focus of today's summit that we're participating in. Next slide, please. Two additional definitions. The first one's from Merriam-Webster Dictionary: afford, to manage, to bear without serious detriment, or to be able to bear the cost of. And then from the Wiktionary, the extent to which something is affordable as measured by its cost relative to the amount the purchaser is able to pay. Next slide, please. So what is the answer? So as the previous slides demonstrated, there's not a universal definition that everyone agrees upon. It really depends in part on your perspective relative to your situation, especially financially, and what your reference points may be. So in its most basic form, it's the financial resources you have available as compared to your expenses. So in other words, what does it cost versus what do you got? I think the other challenge in this, particularly in this state, is that since many folks have gone to a UC or a CSU, parents, relatives, legislators, et cetera, the tendency is to compare things now to when they went. You will often hear, well, when I went to Berkeley in 1982, it was only $100 a semester, or whatever the case might be. So I think that's a little bit of a challenge when we talk about affordability, because you know, virtually everyone knows someone or has a family member who attended one of our public 4 years, yet their kind of point of reference is back when they were going to school. And, you know, things have obviously changed since then. Lastly, I would just like to say that affordable does not necessarily mean free. So I think sometimes there's that tendency too that, well, everything's free or should be free and therefore affordable. Next slide, please, Gil. So what does this mean at the CSU? So at the CSU, 82% of all students, this is undergrads, grad, teacher credential students, or nearly 390,000 students, received some form of financial aid. And that totals more than $4.5 billion. Of our undergraduate population, all undergraduates, nearly 60% have the full cost of their system-wide tuition covered by grants, scholarships, or waivers. And then on the back end, when our students graduate with a bachelor's degree, over half of them, 54%, graduate with zero student loan debt. And then the most recent data from 2018, for those that do graduate with loan debt, our CSU average about a little over 18,000, compared to the California average of about 21.5 and the national average of 29,200. So on the back end, I think as far as the affordability and our students graduating with a reasonable amount of debt, I think we're there, particularly as compared to kind of the national dialogue about the crushing student loan debt. And that's even some talk of that now with the President-elect Biden and, you know, possible cancellation of some amount of student loan debt. On the top end, you know, again, a high proportion, you know, 4 out of 5 students are receiving some form of aid. And then for our undergraduates, you know, in a given room, 6 out of 10 of them are having their tuition fees are covered. So we think that's pretty good. You know, doing the best we can with available resources, both from the feds, from the state, and from institutional resources. Next slide, please, Gil. So I know most of you are familiar with financial aid, but just kind of wanted to go quickly through the main categories. So the federal aid programs, we're talking about gift aid here, which is free money that does not have to be repaid. The main one is the federal Pell Grant. And then the next one is a alphabet soup, but it's Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, FSEOG, and then Iraq and Afghanistan service grants. To be honest, on the last one, the Iraq and Afghanistan grant system-wide out of our, from a previous slide, 388,000 students, maybe a handful get this grant. So it's not something where I would get all excited and be promoting that to students because it's pretty limited in the students that qualify for that. Next slide, please. Then for the state programs at our institutional, so these are available to students that qualify for the federal aid via the FAFSA or undocumented AB 540 students via the DREAM application. So we have Cal Grants A and B, the Chafee Grant, Middle Class Scholarship, and then at the CSU, we have the State University Grant Program, and then our Educational Opportunity Grant Program. And I did want to point out a few nuances here. So for the top 3 programs listed there, Cal Grant, Chafee, and Middle Class Scholarship, the initial determination and administration of that is done by the California Student Aid Commission. So they're part of the process, which can, in some instances, cause confusion for students. So the initial award determination is made by the Student Aid Commission, which provides information on that award, which is just part of their financial aid package. Yet the campus that they have applied to will then put together the other programs which they may be eligible, such as federal Pell Grant, et cetera. So there are oftentimes, there will be a separate kind of communication and timeline from the campuses that doesn't necessarily directly one-to-one sync up with what the Student Aid Commission is doing. So again, this may cause some confusion with students that you're trying to work with. And, you know, in doubt, basically, if in doubt, I would suggest have them check with the campus because sometimes they will know from CSAC that they have a Cal Grant before the campus knows, et cetera. And then also the campus ultimately has to confirm their eligibility, make the award, and then also they will do that, you know, in concert with other programs a student may be eligible for. Okay, next slide, please, Gil. So self-help aid is money that students either work for, work study, or money that must be repaid, loans. And these are only available to federal students eligible for the federal aid via the FAFSA. The federal work study, people often get excited about that and say, well, that's awesome. Students can work on campus. It's like a part-time job, which it is. However, the funding is very, very limited. So system-wide for the Cal State system, for the most recent year, out of the 4.5 billion, only 24 million was in federal work study, and that went to about 7,800 students. So it's a very small percentage, 0.5% of the total aid that our system does. And the reason I bring this up because folks often, suggesting and wanting students to get work study, and there are significant constraints there. And this is primarily because, sorry, I need a little slurp there. Primarily because the campuses get an allocation from the federal government, which is, again, is limiting what is available. Next slide, please, Gil. So how financial aid really works. So some of the programs we just went over at a very high level, each award program has its own terms and conditions. So some awards have to be adjusted based on enrollment. For example, Pell Grant and Cal Grant. What that means is that if the student is enrolled in 12 or more units, which is considered full-time, they get the maximum award amount. But then if they're in less than 12 units, it's a reduced amount. So there's a half-time, a three-quarter time, and a full-time. And I'm just bringing that to your awareness because the number of units in which the student enrolls can impact the amount of aid they're receiving. And obviously with all the concern and push on graduation and 4 years, et cetera, more units is better. And also it ensures that they're maintaining the maximum amount of funding they can get. Many of the programs have limited funds. Our state university grant program, there's a set amount. The federal SEOG program and work study, like I mentioned, both of those our campuses get pretty limited allocations. So again, a lot of students would qualify for them and meet the eligibility criteria, but there's just not enough money to make awards to each and every student. So typically our campuses will prioritize and the awards will go to the students with the highest need, typically as indicated by the expected family contribution. Lastly, on this slide, I just want to say that, to make sure you're all aware, which you probably are, that financial aid is very highly regulated. There are federal, state, and even institutional constraints. So example, if a student drops a class at a certain point in the term, they might owe back some of the aid in which they received. There are things of that nature. If they totally withdraw from the term, then depending on the time in the term, again, there's a whole elaborate calculation where the student might be responsible for repayment. In addition, there's this thing called satisfactory academic progress. So when the students are receiving aid, they're expected to complete a certain number of units and at a certain GPA level. So if they miss on that, then they might either go on probation, which means they've got kind of stricter terms in order to maintain the eligibility, or even be outright disqualified and then either have to kind of requalify their own resources or perhaps do an appeal or something to that level. Next slide, please. Actually, you know what? Let's go back. I'm sorry. Sorry, Gil. Now, in addition to this slide, I did want to talk about what financial aid's role is, though. So financial aid in the financial aid office is provide funding to students to help them pay their educationally related expenses. To the extent possible, campuses will award students the maximum for which they are eligible. Financial aid per se is not intended to replace income. And then there are direct expenses to the university versus others. So in other words, a direct expense would be like the tuition and fees, books, if they're living on campus, housing, versus other expenses, which we'll get into in the next slide, such as transportation, things of that nature. So most funding is limited. So it is important for these students to apply early and by the deadlines. And with this limited funding, it's tough to spread those dollars further. Otherwise, you're maybe reducing the amount per student, which then kind of is contrary to the idea of affordability. And at least within the CSU, financial aid has little to no discretionary funds that they withhold for special cases. So I think there's sometimes this impression, well, if you just ask or appeal, this magical pot of gold appears. That's not the case. Again, because to the extent possible, you're awarding students to their maximum eligibility. And lastly, I guess, is the reality is a student won't necessarily get 100% grants and scholarship coverage. And so I just want to be realistic with folks as far as, some of the, I don't want to say obstacles, but, conditions which a student may face. Okay, Gil, next slide now, please. So what you're seeing here are, for the current academic year, the 2021 academic year for undergraduates, the system-wide average cost of attendance. So these will vary by campus, but this is the system-wide average of all 23 campuses, because as you can imagine, living off campus, the cost in San Francisco is probably different and or higher than in Bakersfield. And there are three categories of student cost of attendance or budget. There are students that live at home or with relatives, which is the first column, and then students living on campus and then off campus. And just for a point of reference, in the CSU, about 38%, so more than a third of our students that are receiving financial aid live at home. They're in that first category, which has the lowest total costs. About 16% live on campus, and then the remaining 46% live off campus. So just to kind of give you an idea on the proportionality. So particularly for the CSU, unlike the University of California system, most of our campuses don't have a huge dorm stock or residence halls, with a couple of exceptions. So again, that's why it's only about 16% of our students. So now we'll go through this kind of row by row. So the first row is the system-wide tuition fees, which are $5,742. That's for the academic year. So per semester, you divide that by 2. The next row, campus fees. This is a system-wide average. So at some campuses, it will be higher than this, and others it will be lower. But for the sake of transparency, we want you to see that there are additional fees beyond tuition. And this is for things like health center, sometimes rec center, student government, technology, things of that nature. The third row, books and supplies, nearly $1,100. And then this is probably where the biggest cost component, if you will, is, and that's room and board. So as you can see, particularly for students living at home, the amount is the least of the three. So that's about $7,900. Living on campus, about $14,500, and then off campus, about $15,200. Now, again, these are system-wide averages. So if a student's applying to Pomona versus Long Beach versus San Diego, they'll be a little different than these. This is simply all 23 of our campuses in the average. And then transportation, that's to and from school, home for the holidays, possibly to work. That also varies by living situation. And then the last category, personal or miscellaneous. These are things for like some level of entertainment, maybe eating out on occasion, laundry, buying hair care products, things of that nature. So then if we go back to the vertical kind of look, so living at home, the total is a little over $20,000. And so for that student living at home, though, the direct expenses they would have to the campus, kind of looking at affordability. So like what's due and payable to the university. So it would be the tuition, one half of that amount for fall semester, the campus fees, again, half of that amount, and then books and supplies if they're happen to be getting them at the campus bookstore. So those are the true kind of direct expenses to the university. And then the remaining items, excuse me, they can and they will often vary. In other words, a student might be living at home and is not, doesn't have $7,900 in expenses. It could be a lesser amount. It could be a higher amount, but we are by regulation to have kind of the estimated typical expenses for the average student, and that's what these are. Transportation, if they live close to school or take the bus, that might be a lot less than the $1,500 or could be higher. Same with personal. The point being, for financial aid purposes and determination, we use the total of 20,234. But again, there's some wiggle room in there, again, depending on the student and the options or choices they might have. Some of those expenses could be less, and so therefore they maybe don't need to work as much, could enroll in more units, may not have to take out a student loan, et cetera. I'll pause on that for a second. Now, living on campus, again, kind of the direct expenses would be the same: the tuition, campus fees, books and supplies, and then room and board would be a direct expense. So for a student living on campus, the kind of the math and is a little different in that that is an amount that's payable and due to the institution. Most, I think all actually will allow for you to get on like a monthly payment plan, et cetera, if necessary. But a student getting financial aid, once their tuition and campus fees are paid, any remainder would go towards the on-campus room and board. And then the last two categories, transportation and personal, again, they have a little more discretion on that as well. And then within the room and board component, this is the typical amount paid. So if perhaps they're in a place where there's a total of 4 roommates versus 2 roommates, the amount they actually pay could be a little bit less than this $14,500. So again, trying to just show and demonstrate where there is some level of flexibility. And then lastly, off campus, again, which is about half our students, 46% of them, off-campus students got to pay tuition, they got to pay campus fees, they got to get books and supplies. So those are kind of the direct expenses. And then again, room and board, transportation and personal, depending on their living situation, could be more or less than what we have here. But again, these are the typical expenses, average expenses for a student that we use for determining financial aid eligibility. Most commonly for students living off campus, it's pretty rare for a student to be living in a 1-bedroom apartment. Oftentimes they will have more than one roommate to reduce those costs. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to mention on this slide. Yes, the other thing is that a lot of our campuses, and I don't think it's unique to the CSU, but for freshmen or for entering students, first-year students, they will require them to live on campus. There are exceptions, like if you live within a certain geographical distance of the campus, you might not have to. You could live at home, but there is a big push for students to live on campus because it helps as far as retention, getting them services, support, particularly for first generation underserved students, kind of that community and those kind of out of classroom supports they need to be successful. So for a freshman student, say from the Riverside area, that's going to be going up to, Sacramento State, they might be required to live on campus. So then they would be in this central kind of column here as far as their costs, and then have, in a sense, a larger bill due to the university. I think the other thing that's a little confusing for folks, and especially for parents, is when they see these numbers or hear one of these presentations. For example, oh, well, our son or daughter is going to live at home. They'll see this and they'll go, well, who do I write a check to for $20,234? And again, it's not all due and payable. And again, some of these items are very flexible, again, depending on what the student is doing. But I want to make sure folks are aware of that. Okay, next slide, please, Gil. So what we have here is a visual representation of, for a student who's entering student, freshman, applying to the university, to the Cal State, both kind of showing the admissions timeline and the financial aid timeline to kind of get an idea of how this syncs or not. So for admissions, they could begin applying in October, and for this year, the deadline is December 4th. Typical year, it's November 30th. So that first row again, so for admissions, October, November, they apply for admission. And then moving over to the right, typically late February or beginning in early March, they get notice or offer of admission if they've been admitted to the institution. So you have that track going on. So these students are applying for admission now, and certainly if you're working with students, And if you're able, check in with them, make sure they have completed the process, and definitely prior to December 4th. Then the middle row, financial aid, is also beginning October 1st. Students can begin applying for financial aid. And the priority application period is March 2nd. March 2nd deadline, that's the state deadline. It's also our institutional deadline. Now, that's not to say students can't apply after that, but that's the priority deadline for maximum consideration for available aid programs. So then once the student has applied and if everything's in order, and once admitted, typically the majority of our campuses will do the financial aid after they've been admitted. They will get the financial aid award or notice. And then the bottom row, again, which I've already talked about, but highlighting them again in red. So the admission deadline comes up first, and then financial aid March, and then May 1st is kind of the, well, it's not kind of, it is the national intent to enroll day, by which students typically have to decide which campus or that they are going to enroll at. So show this slide because I think there are opportunities, perhaps, understanding kind of how these timelines work, that that there might be key touch points for you, or either as a school or an advocate, to check in with students, check in with your students to make sure, okay, have you completed admissions application? Have you done financial aid yet? And then we roll into March. Have you gotten your admission offer? Have you got a financial aid award yet? And then as we're getting closer to May, making sure things are buttoned up, it's so that they don't miss any steps in the process, or kind of go off the rails. And then by the time you figure out something went a foul, it might be too late. So, and then the next slide is kind of a, if you don't mind, Gil, it's the same thing, but in a kind of a narrative form. So again, applying for admission, it's normally in November 30th. This year we extended it to December 4. The financial aid timeline as well. Also making sure you understand here that for Cal Grant, their high school has to verify the GPA. That has a deadline of October 1st, which is already passed. So they've done everything by March 2nd, then they either receive an award letter, or it's often the case that there will be a request for additional information. For example, verification documents. So a verification document might be proof of citizenship, or registration of selective service, or a tax transcript. Once those documents then have been provided to the school and they're received and processed, the school then will issue an award letter. So that's another touch point, or checking in with students is, have they requested any additional documents from you? Have you turned them in? Because turning that stuff in late, or over the course of the summer, will delay them getting an award. And then again, the national intent to enroll deadline is May 1st, as expressed earlier. Okay, next slide, please, Gil. So stressing these points again, but in talking with students, again, things to avoid are pitfalls. Don't want them applying late. So the FAFSA and the DREAM application, and for CSAC and the Cal Grant programs, it's a March 2nd priority deadline. And as I expressed before, more than once, some of the aid programs have limited funding. So by doing things late or after March 2nd, it could very well reduce the number and types of aid programs for which the student will be considered. Now, that's not to say they can't still apply and, for example, get the federal Pell Grant or get a federal direct loan, maybe some institutional money, but again, especially those that are limited funds, unfortunately, we have to kind of, screen or filter and prioritize students who get the funds. And as far as funds, I did want to backtrack a moment because I did leave off a couple of points. Of course, I can't find it here. Awkward silence. So in talking about some of the financial aid program, just to give you an idea, the federal Pell Grant program, which was mentioned earlier, for the CSU, we have nearly 230,000 students get a Pell Grant, and for over $1 billion. So that's by far the largest grant program. And the good news on that is they can apply after March 2nd and still get it if they're eligible. But again, depending on their living situation, if they're just getting a Pell Grant, that maximum award, which is roughly $6,200, won't stretch that far relative to getting their tuition covered, campus fees, et cetera. Our state university grant program for that 18-19 year is about 140,500 students getting nearly $700 million. And then the Cal Grant program, it's about 140,000 students, so a similar number of students getting about $747.5 million. So those three programs alone, the federal Pell, our state university grant program, and Cal Grant are, I'm just doing rough math here, about 2.4 billion. So well over half of that 4.5 billion is in just those programs alone. So again, applying by the deadlines, getting things on time, staying on top of things is very important because there's a lot of dollars at stake here. Next slide, please, Gil. So student role and responsibility. So this is not pitfalls, but you know, in the world of higher education, you know, once the student turns 18, they're kind of considered an adult, and it's expected they're kind of managing and doing everything themselves. So it's important for them to make sure they respond to requests for information from the school. As I mentioned earlier, they might be selected for verification, excuse me, which require they submit documents like tax transcripts. Oftentimes that can be confusing for families, and I know that they've worked with high school counselors, et cetera. Certainly on these things, as you know, reach out to the campus or campuses for which they've applied if there are questions or concerns, or you know, they're not going to be able to make a certain deadline, just to kind of keep things in the right lane. Students should check their email often in their school online portals, and again, respond promptly to requests. And as I've said more than once now, any late responses could affect the timeliness of their award letter. Did want to add a couple other things on this, is that in many cases, once they're admitted and or go through the orientation process, they're assigned a campus email. So your son or daughter might have AOL, well, I don't know if anyone has AOL anymore, but they have Gmail or whatever as their primary email. But then once they're admitted and matriculated to the campus, they'll be assigned a campus email. And so a lot of the communications, the official communications from admissions, from financial aid, from the registrar about orientation or you know deadlines coming up, will go to their campus email. So the student needs to be vigilant in checking that campus email and also their online portal, because the portal will tell them what things might be outstanding or anything that's missing, or have little pop-ups that advise or warn them of things. The other thing that, again, as I mentioned about FERPA, which is Federal Education Right to Privacy Act, is if they're 18, a parent or whomever cannot talk to anyone on campus kind of about what's going on. So they need to find out from the campus what the process is, because most will have a way for them to provide access to parents in order for the parents to talk with campus personnel about maybe their enrollment, financial aid, student accounts, et cetera. And I'm telling you these things not just as some talking head bureaucrat, but I am a parent of a student that goes to a Cal State campus, and you know, I have to keep telling them, you need to go in and check your campus email, because sometimes they will send a parent kind of warn, just a broad thing like, oh, parents, with Thanksgiving coming up and here's COVID thing, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, you need to check your email because they send something about COVID testing and it sounds like you may need to get it. in order to pay his fees or his housing, we had to get us as parents the approved access, the ability to even go online and say pay the monthly housing amount. But again, if you don't know that, then that student, particularly if they're from an underserved or underrepresented community or first in college, they don't have necessarily that social capital or know how things work. So anything you can do to help them in navigating that so that they have all the right things in place would be, I think, most beneficial. And then I think lastly is just reinforce with them, don't assume anything, make sure. So if they say, well, I talked to someone on the phone and they said, yeah, I got a financial aid award. Well, then they need to go in and check on the online portal and actually see it or print it out so they can talk about it with maybe their high school counselor or their parents. So again, don't assume and make sure. And that's kind of what these tools are for, the email and all that. Some campuses are going more to, instant messaging and stuff like that, but a lot of these things are transactions where the student has to provide, they have to turn in a statement of intent to enroll by May 1st. So there's an actual transaction involved, and that usually will include doing something on the portal or, clicking something electronically that they've actually, they're finishing that process. So again, anything you can do to reinforce kind of some of these gotchas and things to look out for, because once they're done at the high school in June, then we kind of, you've heard of the summer melt. So again, if there are ways to check in with them over the summer, our institutions do a pretty good job of, sending reminders, hey, you still haven't turned in X, or Y, so we can determine your residency status or get your financial aid award, or you're missing this and if you want housing. So you kind of, they're kind of, they're post high school, but they're not exactly on campus yet. So they're in this middle part, kind of walking over a bridge. So anything from both ends we can do to kind of, put up the rails to keep them safe, if you will, I think would be greatly appreciated. And certainly if folks have ideas on that, we'd be willing to consider things. And I believe, Gil, that's that.
Okay, and if anybody would like to ask some questions directly of Dean, you can go ahead and post those in the chat, and I'll go ahead and monitor that for us in regards to this time, and we'll just, give us an opportunity for that. Okay, I think there was a lot of great information that was presented, so thank you. So we're almost out of time, but before we end the session, I just wanted to thank Dean. Okay, and Michelle, thanks for the shout out. Enjoyed the presentation, appreciate that, for sharing his expertise with us, for all the wonderful participants. Please know that all the recordings, the PowerPoints, the handouts will be made available within the next week, and an email will be sent out from the CAAC team when that is ready with the directions. Please remember to leave feedback so we can continue to provide you with support that you need at hashtag California College Affordability. Okay, and again, thanks again, Dean. I really appreciate all the great information. A lot of shout outs coming into the chat for you. I appreciate that and sharing that expertise. I want everyone to have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate it. Great information. And I know that everyone has a lot of thank yous coming into the chat. So I know everyone else enjoyed it too. Cool. So really appreciate you being able to share your wisdom and expertise with us today.
All right. Thank you, Gil.
Okay. You have a great day.
All right. Take care.